that was one day, and by the end of that day, and I'm going to relates to this slide. By the end of that day, we have what I believe is 80% of the outline of their strategic plan in the can. Take some synthesis, it's going to take a lot more research, some deep dives into their specific market issues, but we got stakeholder skin in the game, we got diverse inputs, and there was a tremendous amount of agreement around what are sort of the big directions the school should go in. Yesterday, those of you who were in Tim Fish's session, Tim talked about a 4-quadrant approach to sort of figuring out where we're going. And I immediately went up to him and I said, Tim, I think this is similar to your 4-quadrant. So it's very, very similar, but I use slightly different language. So here are 3 really important steps that I urge that Portugal group through and other schools. Number 1, what are some of those guiding lights where you want to be 10 to 20 years from now? Raise that horizon up to 20 years, and what is the best version of our school that we can imagine 10 or 20 years from now? That's where you have to start. Number 2, what are some of the fence lines? What are some of the non-negotiables, the boundary conditions that we're not going to change? At a place like Portugal, they said, you know, we're going to be an Episcopal identity school. At some of your schools, it might be we're going to be a single gender school, or we're going to stay on this campus. Those are some non-negotiables. And then number 3, what are some of the nuance? What are some of the colors? If you were painting a painting, you don't just put a charcoal sketch up there. Tell me what it's going to feel like. What's it going to taste and smell like from the user point of view if this reality comes about? What's going to separate you from other schools? What are you going to be able to do better than any other school with which families have a choice to send their kids? And you know what? It can't be, we have great faculty. If your differentiated value proposition is our kids love our teachers and they have great relationship with their teachers, I hate to break it to you, but that's the value proposition. Every other school says that as well. Public school, charter school, independent schools. So it doesn't differentiate you. You have to figure out what are we going to do better, what are we going to be uniquely powerful at. And to be honest, of all the Post-it notes and all the flag planting and all the sketches and everything that we did in that day at that particular school, it was in distilling these that we saw this amazing convergence down to 4 themes going forward. I'm not going to go into what those are now because that's still a work in progress. But they're 4 very powerful themes, and there was a tremendous amount of convergence around them. So how do we get there? We ask different questions. We don't get to the same place. We don't get different answers than we've had in the past, and we keep asking the same questions. So here's some of the questions that we've asked stakeholders to dig into. What is that best version of yourself in the future? Not tomorrow or 3 years from now, and not what's good, but what's really great and aspirational. We talk about what we can and can't control. There are things that you can't control. Dr. Pearson talked about that. Tim talked about it yesterday in his. We've got to stop whinging and whining and wringing our hands over the things we can't control, but then you have to totally own the things that you can control. And you have to separate out some of the myths about what you can't control. Everybody else says, well, what about colleges? Yeah, we know. Colleges are going through an evolutionary period. Colleges don't know what they're going to be like 20 years from now. We don't know which colleges are going to make it through this period and which aren't. Some of that you can't control. The folks who've joined the Mastery Transcript Consortium think that they can control some of that, and I really, really think it's going to happen. And it may not happen in the exact format it is today, but it's the biggest bat that's being swung. What do our families want or need that we don't provide today? And there's all kinds of strategies for getting, but these are some of the questions that we have to be asking that don't have a yes or no answer. On the other hand, here's some great questions you can send out in a survey. And we just downloaded the survey results from Portugal, and DuBose and I have a 5-hour drive to Charleston right after this, and we're going to be data wonking out on the results of the survey. These are 4 that I include in every time that I go out to a community for survey. And guess what? We did this at a public district in New York one time. It's a public district with 1,800 students. We had a district-wide no homework day. Every kid took home a piece of paper with 4 quadrants, and one of these questions in the 4 quadrants, and their homework was to get a parent or caregiver to respond to those 4 questions and send it back. We had a 75% return on our survey the next day. How many of you get a 75% return when you send a survey monkey out? You don't, right? But if a kid comes home and says, Mom, Dad, Grandma, I need you to fill this out for me for homework, you're much more likely to get it filled out. And I want to share with you a couple of indicators that your community is ready to move, is ready to make that change. Because at the outset, most individuals and most communities are not ready to move. We all know about that. I'm not going to go into all that, the fear, the inertia, all those sorts of things. But here's some key indicators, and this can happen as early as that very first day, that very first time when the stakeholders get together. The recognition, we want something different than what we have. When we ask stakeholders, diverse group of stakeholders, what is your best version of a school? What's great learning look like to you if you had the opportunity unconstrained to offer that? And people say, this is what it is. And we ask them, is that what you're doing today? Well, no. Okay, but you say you want that. If you get people to emotionally understand, this isn't the Board of Trustees told me this is the way our school is going to be, not the head of school who's going to leave us in 2 years or 5 years, but we said we wanted this. That's a huge hook and a huge tipping point. Another big tipping point. Change requires some discomfort. That was the tagline of my #EdJourney book. Changing schools is not hard, it's uncomfortable. And that requires us to grow and to change. And guess what, adults? Isn't this what we ask of our students? Teachers, how many of you ask your students to get outside their comfort zone, to push themselves, to take a risk, etc.? And they all say, well, yeah, I do that. Well, who are they modeling after? They're modeling after us. And so at that point, many people in the room go, yeah, you're right, we need to do this. It's going to be uncomfortable, I get it, but we have to do it anyway. And the final one is what I mentioned before. You're right, we can't control everything, but we have to get that stuff into a parking lot, and we have to collectively own what we can control. And what you can control is an exercise that I talk about in the appendix of the book, which is fabulous. If you ask a bunch of teachers to put Post-it notes on a ledger that says what can we control and what can't we control, they put all this stuff on the side, we can't control this. And then when you really drill down on it, they go, oh, well, yeah, we actually can. We've actually been given permission to do that. We've actually been told to do that. That's actually my responsibility. And all of a sudden, everything ends up on the can control side of the ledger. So that's a huge part of truly owning what we can control rather than falling into some of the mythology. One more set of tools that I think is so important, and then I'll stop for questions. We'll go on to the next section. We talk a lot about distributed leadership, about getting the team, we're breaking these silos and getting teams to work better in our schools. Schools are the most siloized constructs maybe in the history of the world, other than the military. Stanley McChrystal was general head of most of our forces in the really bad days of Iraq in 2006, 2007. If you haven't read Team of Teams, I strongly suggest it. Boiled down into one slide, this is his argument. The traditional hierarchical decision-making structures of schools or the military or corporations they were all based on 19th century Prussian military constructs. They are rigid, slow, tidy, and highly efficient. And McChrystal said, we took this massive, powerful military into Iraq, and we got our butts kicked by people running around in Toyota pickup trucks with IEDs. And we had to fundamentally rethink how to operate in that VUCA environment. And so his concept of a team of teams, a team of a network of teams that have cross-relating responsibilities, that communicate deeply with each other, generate these characteristics of flexibility, the ability to rapid respond. Yeah, they're messy. They aren't nearly as neat and tidy as the formal constructs were, but they're highly effective in times of rapid change. This is exactly what Dr. Pearson was talking about in the keynote, about that sort of nimbleness. I'm not going to go through it all right now. I highly recommend the book. It will resonate so much with you in the way our schools operate. And then the final one in this is this, and this isn't even a part of what I wrote in the book, and I kicked myself that I didn't write this chapter, because it didn't occur to my thick head until last week. When a school up in Canada that I mentioned Canada a lot, I do work with schools in the United States still a lot. Marvelous school up in Canada, one of the gentlemen there asked the question, he says, you know, we asked ourselves, what does our leadership team actually do? What do they actually own? What is their reason for gathering every 2 weeks or whatever it was? And we had a good discussion about it. And I came down on this. I think we all can agree that one of the really, really important roles of a leadership team is to communicate across silos. But if that's all they're doing, we can do that with emails. We can do it in vodcasts. I believe that the leadership team is the group at a school that has to own strategy. They have to own the ongoing work of strategic design and implementation. Yes, boards of trustees are involved. Yes, the head is involved. But heads cannot own the implementation of strategy. It's this integration amongst these departments, amongst these divisions, that will actually create the systems that align with that North Star of where you want to go. I would urge you to have this discussion. Is our leadership team really functioning as the owners of strategic implementation? And if not, who owns that? Because we all know if nobody owns something at a school, it doesn't happen. And if the head owns everything, it doesn't happen. In some schools that some of us have been affiliated with, the head doesn't own very much. And then everybody else has to own all of that. So those are some of the tools. There's a bunch more in the book, chapter by chapter. I just want to sort of highlight those. Okay, let me go on to the last part here. We go back to this, finding the sweet spot of we have to talk about engaging our communities. Probably a lot of you know Seth Godin. You read Seth Godin. This quote, I think, lies at the heart. This was the quote that should be carved into our hearts and minds. Your job is to become irresistible to your community. Now, I just have to take one little quick deviation. Those of you who have children, when you have a 30-year-old daughter who sends you a text one evening at 7 o'clock Pacific time that says, Dad, do you know this guy Seth Godin? And I'm like, I know who he is. I sure don't know him. Oh, yeah, he just cooked dinner for us at his house in the Hudson River Valley. Do you want to talk with him about what you're doing? You know you've succeeded. I did. I got a chance to talk. I couldn't have gotten him any other way. But this, I think, is a really, really important quote. It frames your challenge so well. And there's lots of resources out there about how to do this. The Blue Ocean Shift talks about really looking at your market in a different way. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I think there are some sort of school language permutations of what they talk about in terms of the Blue Ocean strategy. Are you going to break the value-cost trade-off with respect to public schools? Probably not going to break it, because you aren't going to go to zero. Maybe we need to think about shrinking that value-cost delta and how that can happen, and I think it can be. The one that is so clear is that expanding your market, expanding the number of people who will consider you as an option for their family comes down to this one: aligning the whole system of a firm's activities in pursuit of differentiation and, to some degree, whatever we can, cost modification. And there are models of independent schools that are modifying costs. So it's not just about changing what they do, but also what it costs. In order to do that, you have to look at your fundamental operating system of your school. The student-teacher ratio, how subjects are being taught, the physical spaces you're in. All of these are opportunities to change what you're doing in a way that's going to align your North Star, the systems that you have in place, and what you do, what the experience that the students have align to what that community stakeholder vision is of what's going to make your school irresistible. You can't do it without tackling some of these. If you try, you're just tweaking at the margins. If you're fortunate, you're okay. If you believe that the world isn't going to challenge you that much in the next 5, 10, 15 years, you don't have to make significant changes here. I wouldn't be betting all my poker chips on that, and so you might need to consider this. And a lot of it is just enveloping a shift from supply side thinking to demand side thinking. You don't have a school because they built a new subdivision. Somebody else can have a school in that new subdivision for a lot cheaper than you can, or do better than you can. This is about thinking about us. Education now has become subject to demand side thinking of the equation. So a couple of tools. You folks here in SAIS, I didn't realize this. You all fill out you fill out Net Promoter Score, right? I don't think very many other schools around the country do it. Here's all I want to, because you guys are familiar with Net Promoter Score. You know that Net Promoter, if you survey this one question with your families, how likely are you to recommend our school to friends and colleagues? That one question. You know that Net Promoter Score depends on how many people self-identify as a 9 or 10. These add to your Net Promoter Score, these take away, and these don't make any difference. And this is historically across all sorts of industries. So SAIS shared this data with me just last week. These are the median for a whole bunch of schools for 3 or 4 years. This should concern us a little bit. But here's what I want to mention. In the literature, Net Promoter Score for most industries, if you have a 0 or better, that's good. If 50% is like fabulous, well, guess what? Schools aren't like deciding between Ford and Chevy or Miller and Bud. You have people who are really, really enthusiastic about you, so of course you're going to have higher Net Promoter Scores. Why do I even raise this? Because the way you're going to continue to amplify that buzz in the community that you're the school of family choice is to know who your 9s and 10s are and use the heck out of them. Leverage them, engage them, bring them into the conversation. They're the ones who are driving the buzz in your community. You're not getting more students because you're advertising on NPR. You're getting them because your parents are talking at the soccer field about what a wonderful school you are. The jobs to be done model, of course, is another one that NAIS has started to talk about. How many of you have actually asked any of your families, what's the job that we're being hired to do? Anybody? Laura back there is raising her hand. So NAIS has started to do this. Jobs to be done, very easily ask the question. It comes from Theodore Levitt at Harvard. Along this premise, people don't walk into a hardware store to buy a drill bit. They buy into a hardware store because they want a hole in the wall. And there's a great Seth Godin quote that I'm not going to read. It's in the book, but I don't have time to read it. It's fabulous. Seth takes it about 10 degrees deeper than this. So what are the jobs that traditionally schools have been hired to do? This is fundamentally changing. And I have a slight area of disagreement with how NAIS is approaching this. They're a lot smarter than I am. But I think both points of view are worth considering. Here are some of the traditional jobs that schools have been hired to do. Yeah? When I was in school, I think probably all of those would have applied. What are we starting to see now, both through the NAIS data, and I've asked this question now to thousands of stakeholders at a range of schools. What are we starting to see? Wow, help my child be future ready. Give my child opportunities to impact the world in a positive way. Teach my child how to effectively work as a member of a team. Does this mean that those other ones aren't valid any longer? We don't have to prepare kids for college. We don't have to prepare them for the next grade level. We don't have to keep them safe. Of course not. Those are still relevant. But we have to look at what is going to inspire, what's going to thrill, what is going to make us irresistible to our community, and it isn't in preparing my kid to succeed in 5th grade. That is not going to make your school irresistible to your community, whereas some of these things will. So we need to start asking those questions. What about actually measuring how well we're doing? I'm getting toward the end here. We actually have tools, many of which come from outside of education, that allow us to measure, are we actually doing better because we're being innovative? Is our balance of exploitation versus exploration consistent with our strategic objectives? There's a good body of thought. Alex Pentland at MIT is one who says that the most highly performing teams are ones that spend 90% of their time exploring and 10% of their time implementing. That's a big deal. And that's based on some really interesting data in Pentland's book, Social Physics. Do the metrics that we use ourselves shortchange investment in market-creating innovation? If we're measuring our success by the number of kids who got into the Ivies, how innovative are we going to be in ways that maybe the Ivies don't value? And I'm not dissing the Ivies. I mean, Stanford's a whole different thing, because I'm a Stanford guy. They take all the good creative kids. I'm just kidding. Are we actually properly organized to support and protect our innovation? These are things we can measure. You all write rubrics for a living, and there are rubrics that exist for these, and you can write your own. But this is the sort of thinking we have to go into and to measure. Are we getting better? Are we doing better by our community? Are we becoming more well-aligned with our community? Because if we're not, we either we have to stop doing what we're doing, we have to change somehow. There's one set that I put into the book that is actually fairly quantitative. There's a lot of qualitative stuff, but here's fairly quantitative. If you look at the change efforts in your school, the pilots you're running, the change initiatives, you can actually track these over time. They have we were talking a question earlier about rapid prototyping, iteration, and all that. How much are we investing? How many projects do we have that are in the research phase, the prototype phase, the pilot stage, the implementation stage? How long are the projects in that stage? How many of them advanced? Who's involved in those? Do we have 10 innovators that are driving the entire school? Or are we growing the number of innovators and people who are willing to try a pilot or a project? That's real data that will tell you whether or not your school is becoming more adept and more comfortable with change than it was in the past. And so we have these sorts of metrics that exist out there. 2 more slides and I'm going to shut up. I've been ending a lot with these, and I decided to end the book with these, and I changed them a little bit even this morning. Here are 5 things that I think if you want to wrestle with some meaty challenges that could really potentially differentiate your school. I mean seriously differentiate your school. Here are 5 ideas. Number 1, how are we going to get better? How are we and our students going to get better at true empathy, specifically related? I get to say this because I'm an old white man that is finding out just how much bias I've had in my life. And it's not a pretty sight. And I know I can't get there when we don't have enough people of color in the room, and thank God I found out this morning that 58% of attendees here are women. We have hope. I have hope with that. So number 1, how do we really, really embed that and work with it? Number 2, how are we going to raise students that understand the difference between fact and fiction? I truly believe that the American democracy is founded on the rule of law, and the rule of law is based on some degree of objective truth. If we don't get past this issue of what's real and what's not real in our world, I think our society is severely threatened, and this is something we can learn, right? We can teach this and people can learn it. Number 3, finding this balance with respect to technology between the power of technology and the toxicity of technology. We're just now realizing how toxic these things are, that we've been pushing, access to the internet for 20 years, the greatest learning tool in the world. These things are really, really a problem. We know that now. How are we going to balance that? I don't know. If you figure that one out and can sell that to your parents, that we're a place that understands how to raise your children and help you as a family get through there, I think that's huge. Number 4 is learning a respect for expertise. Our kids are pummeled with social media, where anybody who has a big social media footprint and can write a blog, our kids need to understand that that person didn't get 2 PhDs in the subject, and maybe you should be able to balance and weigh those yourself as you become a lifelong learner. And that problem is only going to increase over time. And number 5, every one of your school I know is talking about student wellness and adult wellness. This is one of those things where a whole lot of people are talking about it, and a few of you are really, really, really going to embed it deeply into your program. And I believe that with parents, if you get them to understand that you are going to actually truly embed wellness into the program, it's going to be a big deal for them, because they all know the stuff that Deborah was talking about yesterday in terms of what especially upper middle class white kids are facing. I'll just mention really quickly that in the appendix of the book, there's a whole lot of, I dumped all kinds of resources in there. That's what they are. You'll see it when you get there, but I sort of dumped everything that I know on all my workshop tactics and archives and everything in there. And then finally, I just want to end with this. Race car drivers traveling around the track at 200 miles an hour do not focus on the bottom third of the windshield. And I know that you'll have to go back to school tomorrow, and the tendency is, day job comes back, and there goes your vision right down to the bottom third of the windshield. Somebody has to continue to push your vision up to the top third of the windshield in a time when things are changing quickly. And you know what? That's the hand you all have been dealt, or you wouldn't be here today. Well, look, I really thank you folks. Again, there may be hopefully a few copies of the book left that you can always